Lecture 12. Distributed Intelligence and Swarm Neural Systems. Brains without bosses. If lateralization is one form of organized asymmetry in the brain, then distributed intelligence is its counterpoint, a way of understanding cognition not as the product of a single, top-down control center, but as the emergent outcome of many interacting parts. In this lecture, we explore swarm intelligence, modular computation, and distributed neural systems across species, from ants and bees to slime molds and octopuses. We'll unpack how nature solves complex problems without hierarchy, and what this reveals about the limits of our own centralized brains. Let's begin with a simple but profound question. Do you need a brain to think? If thinking means processing information, optimizing behavior, learning from experience, and coordinating actions in response to the world, then the answer is clearly no. Consider the slime mold, Physarum polycephalum. It has no neurons, no brain, not even a nervous system, yet it can solve mazes, optimize foraging paths, remember past environments, and balance multiple goals simultaneously. In laboratory experiments, slime molds have even replicated the layout of rail networks, famously the Tokyo subway map, by spreading through nutrient-packed channels in an efficient pattern. This brainless blob achieves such feats by growing, retracting, and reinforcing its web of protoplasmic tubes based on feedback from the environment. It's not symbolic reasoning, but it is problem-solving behavior. Recent research has revealed that the slime mold actually encodes memories of food encounters in the thickness of its tubes, storing information in its own body structure. A chemical released at a food site softens the nearby tubes, leaving a persistent imprint that later guides the organism's future movements. In other words, Physarum weaves past experiences into its network architecture and uses that record when making decisions. What's going on here? We are witnessing distributed computation, a form of intelligence that emerges not from a top-down commander, but from local interactions governed by simple rules. Now scale up this idea to a society of tiny brains. Eusocial insects, ants, bees, termites, provide natural examples. Individually, each insect has a very limited nervous system. A bee has under 1 million neurons, an ant even fewer. Yet, as a colony, they achieve wonders far beyond the sum of their parts. Ants cooperatively form living bridges and rafts with their bodies, find the shortest paths to food, and even farm fungi for food. Honeybees, often called a superorganism, collectively build precise hexagonal combs, regulate the hive temperature to within a degree, fend off predators, and send out scouts to explore, up to 10 kilometers away. Termites, without any architect in charge, collaboratively erect towering mounds that maintain stable internal climate. They continuously adjust the structure to ventilate CO2 and keep the nest in a narrow temperature range ideal for their fungal crops. These sophisticated behaviors emerge from swarms of simple agents following simple rules. No individual ant or bee grasps the master plan, yet coherent adaptive organization arises. Case studies. Swarm intelligence in nature. From slime molds to insect colonies, from octopus arms to human societies. Distributed architectures represent a second path to cognition, one less reliant on a boss or central executive. To appreciate this fully, let's dive into several case studies across the tree of life. Each example will show intelligence, coordination, and adaptability emerging without an obvious commander in charge. Honeybee superorganism. Consider the honeybee, Apis mellifera, colony. A single honeybee has about 960,000 neurons. Modest compared to a human, or even a mouse. Yet the colony as a whole performs astonishing tasks. Together they construct wax combs with mathematical precision, keep the brood nest at ~35 DGSE, vital for larvae, by cooling with water droplets and fanning, or by clustering for warmth, defend the hive en masse with coordinated stinging attacks, and flexibly reallocate labor as the seasons change. The hive behaves as if it were a multicellular organism, with individual bees analogous to the cells in a body. This emergent colony-level intelligence arises from a few key principles. Task partitioning. Bees specialize in tasks based on age and physiology. Young workers tend to nursing and hive duties, middle-aged bees clean and guard, older bees become foragers. No bee generalizes across all roles at once. Each follows its developmental programming, mediated by hormones, to do one job, and the aggregate effect is an efficient division of labor. Signal propagation. Bees communicate using pheromones, vibrations, and the famous waggle dance. A forager performs a figure-8 waggle dance to encode the direction and distance of a food source, recruiting others to that location. Pheromone signals can rally a defensive response or signal the presence of a queen. Through these signals, information spreads throughout the hive without any bee issuing orders. Feedback loops. The colony employs both positive and negative feedback to reach decisions. A rich food source elicits more enthusiastic dances. Positive feedback, recruiting more foragers, whereas discovery of danger triggers stop signals. If a returning bee was attacked by a predator or competing colony, she will deliver an inhibitory stop signal, a brief buzz accompanied by a headbutt, to dancing bees, advertising that location. This negative feedback halts recruitment to dangerous sites and helps the colony avoid collective disasters. The stop signal in honeybees is a sophisticated form of negative feedback in a superorganism's communication, akin to a safety check that counterbalances the excitatory waggle dance. Through these mechanisms, a single scout bee can convince the entire hive to move to the new home site, not by barking orders, but by initiating a decentralized consensus. In fact, when a swarm needs to choose a nest site, dozens of scout bees dance to promote different locations. Over time, bees observe each other and gradually converge on one choice. Once a threshold of agreement, a quorum is reached. This process uncannily mirrors quorum sensing in bacteria and distributed decision algorithms in computing. The honeybee colony, as a whole, thinks through its options via a chorus of many small votes. Naked mole rat colonies. Switching from insects to mammals, we find a similar principle in the naked mole rat, Heterocephalus glaber. These bizarre, hairless rodents live in underground colonies with a queen and subordinate castes, much like ants or termites. They are one of the only eusocial mammals. In their labyrinthine burrows, a few individuals do all the breeding, while others specialize in digging tunnels, defending the colony, or caring for the young. Each mole rat responds to local cues, such as the smell of a predator or the presence of pups needing food, without any mole rat overseeing the entire colony's agenda. What's particularly intriguing is how their nervous systems are tuned to this life. Naked mole rats have smaller brains than expected for their body size, and notably fewer neurons than similar rodents, yet they have enlarged regions devoted to smell and touch, the senses needed in dark underground environments. Their neocortex, the part of the brain for higher processing, is relatively diminished, while subcortical structures for social and olfactory processing are dense. In essence, evolution budgeted their neural resources for distributed cooperation rather than individual innovation. No single mole rat has a mental map of the whole burrow or a grand plan, but by each following simple rules, e.g. dig where you feel fresh air, feed pups that give off certain pheromones, the colony sustains itself. In both honeybees and mole rats, intelligence emerges from local rules, role specialization, and constant communication, instead of any centralized authority. Octopus, the distributed brain. Now let's revisit one of nature's cleverest invertebrates, the octopus. Octopuses, e.g. Octopus vulgaris, have about 500 million neurons, comparable to a small dog. But here's the catch. Over 2/3 of those neurons reside not in the head, but in the arms. Each of an octopus's 8 arms contains its own neural mini-network, including clusters of neurons called ganglia that control the arm's movements and senses. These peripheral brains allow the arms to execute decisions and actions with a remarkable degree of autonomy. The central brain issues high-level goals like explore that crevice for food, but how an arm carries out that goal is largely decided within the arm itself. For example, an octopus can be busily engaged with a task using 2 arms, say manipulating a shell, while the other arms independently feel around in underwater nooks and crannies for potential prey. If an arm finds something interesting, it doesn't need permission from the head. It reacts on the spot. This would be like each of your hands and feet having a mind of its own, hunting for snacks in your couch cushions while you read a book. Laboratory experiments dramatically illustrate this autonomy. If an octopus arm is surgically removed, under anesthesia, the severed arm will continue to respond to stimuli for up to an hour, performing reflexive actions like reaching, grasping, and even attempting to feed an imaginary mouth. One study found that a detached octopus limb will recoil from unpleasant stimuli and will grab food and move it in the direction of where the mouth used to be. In a sense, the arm knows what to do without consulting the brain. Even in the intact animal, the arms often initiate actions on their own. Octopus researchers have observed that octopuses can twist open screw-top jars and solve puzzles largely through the exploratory movement of their arms. The brain sets the goal but doesn't micromanage the solution. The arm suckers can taste and touch, making decisions about whether an object is food or foe on the fly. This decentralization allows an octopus to be the ultimate multi-taker. It can literally be in 8 places at once, feeling its way through the world. The octopus forces us to ask, where is the mind in such a creature? In the head, the arms, or the network of all its parts? The answer seems to be that mind is network. The octopus has a distributed mind, a melding of a central brain for integrating information and learning from complex experiences, with semi-autonomous limbs that handle low-level decisions. The central brain is more like a coordinator or orchestra conductor than a tyrant issuing rigid commands. The central brain is more like a coordinator or orchestra conductor than a tyrant issuing rigid commands. This anatomy has some amazing advantages. Parallelism. The octopus can investigate multiple things at once. While the main brain considers one problem, e.g., is that diver a threat or not, the arms can simultaneously map different corners of the environment, test the texture of rocks, and capture prey. The animal effectively parallels its cognitive processes. Something our brains do internally but within one head, the octopus does it by outsourcing to its arms. Local intelligence. Each arm can learn and adapt. There's evidence that octopus arms can form short-term memories. In lab tests, if an octopus learns to unscrew a jar to get a treat, its arms get better at the required motions. If the task is repeated, the arms perform the maneuver more fluidly, even if the central brain isn't dictating every step. The arm's neural circuitry handles the fine motor learning, and the central brain doesn't need to know the exact details of twist 30 degrees then pull. It simply reaps the reward when the jar opens. Embodied computation. The body itself does computational work. In octopuses and other animals like starfish, the morphology, a soft, flexible body with distributed control, means some problems are solved by the body's physical interaction with the environment, rather than brain deliberation. For example, an octopus arm conforming to the shape of a cave crevice is partly a mechanical solution. The soft arm just fits automatically, guided by local reflex circuits, rather than the brain, having to calculate the cave's geometry and instruct the arm how to contort. The octopus shows us an evolutionary extreme, a hybrid system where a centralized intent, a complex brain capable of learning and planning, is combined with peripheral execution, limbs endowed with their own brains. The result is a highly versatile intelligence. The octopus can be bold, curious, and even cunning. They've been known to sneak out of aquarium tanks to steal crabs from neighboring tanks, yet it achieves this with an internal democracy of neurons, rather than a neural monarchy. It's a living proof that a creature can be smart without having all its smarts in one place. Distributed bits of human brains. Lest we think that distributed intelligence is only for alien creatures and insects, consider examples within our own bodies. While the human brain is highly centralized in some respects, it also delegates a great deal of processing to local circuits. The spinal cord, for instance, contains networks known as central pattern generators that can produce rhythmic movements like walking or swimming without input from the brain. In humans, basic stepping motions and reflexes can persist even after the spinal cord is severed from the brain. With training or electrical stimulation, patients with spinal injuries can regain some rhythmic leg motion, showing that the spinal circuitry can generate the pattern for walking on its own. These spinal circuits were honed by evolution long before primates had big brains. They act faster than conscious thought. If you accidentally touch a hot stove, you'll yank your hand away before your brain feels the pain. That's the work of a local reflex loop in your spinal cord. The brain only finds out after the fact. Another semi-autonomous neural network in humans is the enteric nervous system, often called the second brain, and in our gut. The human gut is lined with over 500 million neurons that form intricate plexuses governing digestion, enzyme secretion, and gut motility. This enteric system can function independently. It regulates peristalsis, the waves of muscle contractions that move food, and even has its own reflexes. It's connected to the brain via the vagus nerve and others. But if you sever those connections, the gut will still continue basic operations. Anyone who's felt butterflies in their stomach when anxious has experienced the gut-brain conversation. But note that the gut has its own voice in that dialogue. It's not just a passive follower of the head brain. It sends signals about hunger, satiety, and even emotional state via serotonin and other neurotransmitters back to the brain. This second brain exemplifies how evolution often builds control systems in layers. The gut needed to manage digestion long before creatures had sophisticated brains. So, a local intelligence evolved there and persists in us today, quietly doing its job so our big brain can focus on other things. If distributed control is so powerful and ubiquitous, one might ask, then why do creatures like us even have a big centralized brain? Why aren't we just a set of loosely connected mini-brains that somehow get along? The answer lies in the challenges of coordination and integration. Distributed systems excel at parallel processing and robustness, but they can struggle with achieving global coherence quickly. A centralized brain can integrate information from across the whole organism, resolve conflicts, set priorities, and make fast executive decisions when needed. Think of an emergency. If a threat looms, a brain that can instantly coordinate the whole body's response, fight, flee, freeze, has an advantage over a collection of independent units that might each react differently. Central control is great for orchestrating a unified response, especially in rapidly changing situations. It's also efficient for scenarios that require a single focus or a linear sequence of actions. You typically want one coherent train of thought when solving a math problem, not 8 competing trains at once. Yet, distributed components persist in even the most centralized brains because they offer resilience, specialization, and scalability. Local circuits can keep ticking when higher centers fail, as in the spinal walking example, providing backups. Specialized modules can evolve to handle niche tasks, like face recognition or language, extremely well, without overburdening a general processor. And distributed networks can grow in size and complexity more readily. A network of semi-independent units can scale without hitting the bottleneck of a single control unit. This is why our brain isn't a single giant neuron boss telling all the little neurons what to do, but rather 86 billion neurons self-organizing via trillions of connections. Evolution has retained both centralized and distributed strategies, blending them for the best of both worlds. As we'll see, most complex systems, including our own brains, are neither pure hierarchy nor pure swarm. They are hybrids, part orchestra, part jazz ensemble. Modular minds, networks, and hybrid control. Our exploration so far suggests that intelligence can emerge in surprising forms: a colony of insects, a tangle of slime mold tubes, an octopus body. We also see that even in highly centralized creatures like ourselves, many intelligent functions are distributed across semi-autonomous modules. This compels us to update our very definition of mind. Rather than a single command center issuing orders, perhaps a mind is better thought of as a community of smaller processes working in concert and occasionally at odds. Neuroscientific evidence strongly supports this view. The human brain is composed of networks and modules that have a degree of independence. Let's examine how our brains and modular intelligence, and how they still manage to work as a cohesive whole. One of the great revelations of neuroscience in recent decades, thanks to brain imaging and connectomics, is that the brain is organized into large-scale networks. When you are at rest, certain groups of regions hum together in what's called the default mode network, DMN, which is associated with daydreaming, self-reflection, and consolidation of memory. When something important grabs your attention, a different set of areas, often termed the salience network, lights up to filter the signal from the noise. When you engage in a demanding task, a set of frontal and parietal areas form a central executive network to focus attention and problem solve. These networks are not neat anatomical compartments like organs. They are more like overlapping circles of friends that frequently communicate amongst themselves. What's key is that they operate somewhat independently, each processing information on its own timescale and competing or collaborating with the others as circumstances demand. In fact, some researchers have described the brain as a collection of local specialists that continually negotiate to control your behavior. Your subjective sense of being one coherent self is the outcome of this negotiation, a fragile consensus among competing neural factions. We can see hints of these internal divisions in certain clinical conditions. In dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder, what appears to be happening is an abnormal compartmentalization of mental modules. Different identities take turns dominating consciousness, as if the normal committee meeting of the brain's subsystems has fractured into separate meetings entirely. In schizophrenia, instead of one neatly unified reality, patients may experience hallucinations and delusions that reflect multiple internally generated models of the world that the brain can't reconcile. In essence, a failure of the networks that normally integrate thoughts and perceptions into a single coherent stream. Modern theories of schizophrenia indeed characterize it as a disorder of disconnectivity among brain networks, especially involving the default mode, internal narrative, salience, reality monitoring, and executive control networks. The voices a schizophrenic patient hears might be their own internal monologues, ordinarily suppressed or integrated, now breaking free as isolated agents because the binding networks are impaired. Even in brain injury or stroke, we find that damage to specific hubs or connection points can cause surprisingly broad deficits. A relatively small lesion in a hub region like the precuneus or insula, areas with high network centrality, can disrupt communication across multiple networks, leading to worse cognitive outcomes than a larger lesion in a less connected area. In short, when the bridges between modules are damaged, the whole mental economy suffers greatly, sometimes more than when a bit of real estate is lost on the periphery. Before we get too deep into pathology, let's solidify the point. The brain is a network, not a monolith. It has hubs and communities, signal pathways and feedback loops. It has redundancy. Multiple pathways can support the same function. And specialization. Certain circuits do some things, but not others. This is strikingly analogous to how a society or organization might work. The self that we experience is not a single CEO neuron making all decisions. It's more like a city council meeting, or, as one neuroscientist cheekily put it, a neural parliament, where different coalitions advocate for different needs: hunger, fear, curiosity, habit, goal-oriented planning, etc. We normally don't notice the parts disagreeing because the brain has mechanisms to enforce consensus, or at least suppress dissenting voices to a subtle background hum. But when those mechanisms falter, due to trauma, drugs, or disease, the pluralism of the mind becomes very apparent, sometimes painfully so. To better understand how a distributed mind still functions as a mind, we should examine the integration protocols that tie the whole ensemble together. In technological networks, we think of communication protocols or consensus algorithms. In the brain, some analogous processes include synchronization. Neurons and regions can synchronize their rhythmic firing, oscillations, to effectively bind information across distances. For example, when you see an apple, different parts of your cortex process color, shape, motion, etc., yet you perceive a unified object. One theory is that neurons representing the apple's redness, roundness, and movement fire in synchrony, say in the gamma frequency ~40 Hz, effectively tagging those features as part of one object. This kind of transient synchrony is like establishing a common radio frequency for distant modules to share information. Both brains and insect colonies use synchrony. In an insect swarm, you might see rhythmic waves or collective pauses that coordinate the group temporarily. A crude analog of neurons oscillating together to link features. Hierarchical gating. While no one's always the boss in a distributed system, sometimes you need a temporary leader. The brain achieves this through top-down signals that modulate, not dictate, the activity of lower areas. For instance, your frontal cortex can send inhibitory signals to sensory areas to filter out distractions, essentially saying, pipe down, vision, we're focusing on something else now. When you're scared, the amygdala, an emotion center, can powerfully gate what you pay attention to, biasing cognition toward threat stimuli. These aren't permanent dictatorships, but momentary leadership roles, a bit like a jazz ensemble where, for one song, the saxophone takes the lead, then later the piano leads. In the brain, this dynamic assignment of who's in charge happens through changes in neural excitability and connectivity. You can think of it as certain nodes borrowing a leader badge when the context demands it. For example, if you're driving in a storm, your sensory and motor circuits take the lead, while daydreaming, default mode, is subdued. Later, when you relax at home, the hierarchy shifts. Plasticity and rewhiting. The brain continuously updates the strength of connections based on experience, the old cells that fire together, wire together principle. This learning process doesn't just occur within modules, but across them. If a certain set of modules working together yields a rewarding outcome, the connections among them might be reinforced. If a module's output is consistently erroneous, other modules might start ignoring it more. Over time, this adaptive reweighting tunes the network for coherence and effectiveness. It's as if each part of the brain has a vote on others' influence, and those votes shift based on recent performance. In a social analogy, imagine a team where members learn over time whose advice tends to be reliable for which kind of problem. Gradually, the group weights its members' inputs differently, depending on context, leading to smarter collective decisions. Through synchronization, gating, plasticity, and other mechanisms, like neuromodulators, chemicals that globally adjust connection strengths during states like arousal or sleep, the brain finds unity in diversity. No single neuron or area runs the show all the time, but neither is the system a free-for-all. Instead, intelligence emerges when the modules speak the same language, adhere to certain rules of engagement, and flexibly assign control. When working well, this produces a dynamic harmony. When it breaks down, we see dissonance. Mental illness can be viewed as network discord, and brain injuries as broken links in the conversation. Let's illustrate this with an everyday example: catching a ball. This simple act engages a distributed set of processes. Your eyes track the ball, visual cortex. Your inner ear and cerebellum coordinate your balance and anticipate trajectory. Your spinal cord and muscles execute the catching motion. And perhaps your prefrontal cortex is preoccupied with not dropping the popcorn in your other hand. Remarkably, you can catch a ball without consciously thinking through the physics. In fact, if you try to think step by step, okay, move hand 10 cm to the left, now close fingers, you'll likely fumble. This is the wisdom of delegation. Let the well-tuned sensoromotor circuits do their job, handling milliseconds scale adjustments, while conscious thought, which operates on a slower scale, steps back. Your brain's higher centers set the goal, catch it, but then trust the distributed network, spine, cerebellum, etc., to carry it out. You, the conscious CEO, only intervene if something unusual happens. The ball suddenly changes course, or your other hand catches fire. Most of the time, you don't need to micromanage routine tasks, and in fact, performance is better when you don't. This underscores a key point. Intelligence in natural systems often arises from letting each component handle what it's best at, and only escalating control when necessary. You are a conductor, not a one-man band. Given this perspective, consider conditions where these local circuits misfire or override the usual hierarchy. In Tourette syndrome, for example, motor and vocal tics erupt, seemingly against the will of the individual. Research implicates abnormal activity in the basal ganglia, deep brain structures involved in action selection and habit formation that generates involuntary actions, while the frontal cortex's attempts to suppress them sometimes fail. Here, a normally well-behaved module, the habit circuit, goes rogue with excessive output, and the top-down control doesn't fully rein it in. In epilepsy, a small cluster of neurons can get stuck in a positive feedback loop of excitation, dragging the rest of the brain into runaway synchronous firing, a seizure. The usual balancing acts, inhibition, desynchronization, that keep local ensembles autonomous yet cooperative, break down. These cases remind us that a distributed system isn't automatically benevolent or stable. It requires governance. The brain's governance is usually implicit in its chemistry and connectivity, but when it falters, the unity of self and control of behavior can spectacularly collapse. So what does the brain's governance look like? As we outlined, oscillations, gating, network resets, like sleep, which is thought to recalibrate synaptic weights and maybe prune misbehaving connections, and so on. It's striking how much this mirrors maintaining order in any complex system. There must be rules, communication channels, and fail-safes. In a honeybee colony, for instance, if too many foragers are out depleting resources and not enough are nursing the young, feedback signals, pheromones from hungry larvae, will prompt more bees to switch to nursing. In the brain, if one network, say the default mode, is overactive at an inappropriate time, another network, salience or executive, may intervene with inhibitory signals to restore balance. Neither is permanently superior. It depends on context, a feature of what's called a heterarchical system, as opposed to strict hierarchy. The brain is often described as having a heterarchical organization. Any region can influence any other given the right conditions, and leadership is fluid, not fixed. We can summarize the advantages and pitfalls of distributed systems in a quick list. Advantages? They are resilient. If one part fails, others can compensate. Scalable, adding more units usually adds capacity without clogging a single bottleneck. Adaptable, components can change without needing to redesign the whole. And excellent at parallel processing. Many things get done at once. Trade-offs. They often reach decisions more slowly. Consensus takes time, as any committee knows. Can be ambiguous or conflicted, with no single authority. Disagreements might linger. Think of indecision when different parts of your brain want different things. And may lack a global perspective. Each local unit doesn't see the big picture. The brain's design seeks to maximize the strengths while mitigating the downsides through the integrative mechanisms we discussed. Interestingly, these same principles are being rediscovered in artificial systems. In robotics, the subsumption architecture pioneered by Rodney Brooks in the 1980s threw out the idea of a central planning CPU in favor of layered behaviors. Instead of a robot explicitly calculating a full plan of action, you give it simple modules. One that says, "Don't hit obstacles." Another that says, "Wander around." Another that says, "If you see a target, move toward it." These modules operate in parallel, and at any moment the most pertinent behavior takes control. For instance, avoid obstacle will subsume wander if an object is in the way. This led to robots that could adapt in real time to changing environments, without any central map or complex computation, much like an insect navigating a forest floor. Modern AI, after a detour into purely centralized deep learning models, is also exploring more modular distributed approaches again. Consider transformer-based large language models, the kind of AI that underpins GPT-PuG systems. These models use a mechanism called attention, which, in effect, allows different parts of the input, say words in a sentence, to dynamically decide which other parts are most relevant, without a central controller dictating it. Every word's representation can draw information from any other word's representation through a weighted attention matrix. In doing so, the model self-organizes the structure of the sentence, essentially creating an emergent pass or pattern rather than following a rigid pre-programmed grammar tree. In a way, attention is a bit like a bunch of neurons, or subnetworks, all voting on what the focus should be, which sounds a lot like a distributed prioritization process. The result is that these models can capture complex relationships and even emergent structure, without an explicit boss node deciding the pass. It's as if the model's knowledge is distributed across many weights and units, and coherence arises from the interaction of many small, attention-driven computations. In reinforcement learning, the type of AI where agents learn by trial and error, a common approach is to separate the policy network, which maps states to actions, what do I do in this situation, from the value network, which estimates how good a given state is, how well am I doing. This is akin to having a fast automatic subsystem that produces behavior. You can liken it to the cerebellum or to habits, and a slower evaluative subsystem that critiques and guides longer-term strategy, analogous to the prefrontal cortex, or deliberative thought. The policy network might be making split-second decisions, while the value network occasionally nudges the policy to favor choices that lead to better outcomes down the line. This mirrors the hybrid control in animals. For example, a deer has spinal circuits to rapidly coordinate running, policy-like, and a brain that decides where to run, towards cover or open field, value-like. In AI, these multi-menc systems have had great success. AlphaGo famously used separate policy and value networks. For instance, they demonstrate that splitting cognitive functions into specialized agents and then orchestrating their interaction can be more powerful than a monolithic approach. Whether in brains or machines, hybrid systems work because they balance exploration with control, autonomy with coordination. A purely centralized system might be too rigid or overwhelmed. Imagine one traffic light trying to control all traffic in a city. Impossible. A purely distributed system might meander or stall. Imagine every car driving with no traffic rules at all. But a system where local units handle local problems and occasional global signals synchronize or reorient the whole can achieve both efficiency and flexibility. Stepping back, what lessons does this offer us about our own neuroscience? First, it reminds us that intelligence is not a single thing. It's an emergent property of many subsystems, each with its own memory, its own way of processing information, and its own speed and logic. Our emotional brain, centered in circuits like the amygdala and limbic system, operates rapidly and with a blunt, survival-oriented logic, a bit like a fire alarm, quick and noisy, Our sensory systems provide detailed, high-fidelity representations, but can be overwhelmed by too much input, like high-resolution cameras that can be blinded by glare. Our memory systems, hippocampus and associates, store experiences, but often do so in associative, story-like ways rather than literal accuracy. You remember the gist of your childhood birthday party, not every single detail. Our motor planning circuits, basal ganglia, motor cortex, cerebellum, optimize for fluid action, anticipating and correcting in milliseconds, often entirely outside of conscious awareness. All of these components must come together for you to do something as simple as ride a bicycle while singing a song and reminiscing about yesterday. The brain doesn't achieve this integration by forcing everything to be the same. It lets each system do what it's best at, then builds bridges between them so they can inform each other. It's a bit like a well-run city. Diverse neighborhoods, industry, art, science, etc., with their own internal culture, connected by roads and communication lines that allow the whole metropolis to function. Integration and its failures. Understanding distributed intelligence also sheds new light on what happens when things fall apart. We touched on some clinical examples, but let's delve a bit deeper into how modular disintegration reveals the inner workings of the mind. Consider a few striking neuropsychological phenomena. Alien hand syndrome. This occurs typically after damage to the corpus callosum, which connects the brain's hemispheres or frontal cortical areas. A patient's left hand, say, might start doing things on its own, unbuttoning a shirt the right hand just buttoned, or grabbing objects the person does not intend to grab. The person may feel estranged from that limb, as if it has a will of its own. In reality, what's likely happening is that the normal, inhibitory communication between hemispheres, or between higher intent and lower motor modules, has been severed, allowing the motor programs in one hemisphere to operate without the oversight of the other. The committee of the brain effectively loses a member or stops communicating with it, and that member carries on with its default behavior. The alien hand illustrates that even something as intimate as the sense of our body being under our control is an emergent property of modules agreeing with each other. When they don't agree, one hand can literally have a mind of its own. Split brain patients. In severe epilepsy, sometimes surgeons cut the corpus callosum to prevent seizures from spreading between hemispheres. After this, patients seem normal in many ways, but subtle tests reveal that the left and right hemispheres can act like two separate minds. Since language is usually in the left hemisphere, if you flash a word to the patient's right visual field, which goes to the left brain, they can read it out loud. Flash a word to the left visual field, going to the silent right brain, they cannot say what they saw. But the right hemisphere might be able to signal its knowledge by drawing a picture or guiding the left hand to pick up an object corresponding to the word. In some split brain cases, patients exhibit open conflict. One hand might start a task and the other hand undo it, or the patient verbally express a desire while the opposite hemisphere frowns or disagrees in their behavior. It's as if two eyes coexist in one skull, each unaware of what the other knows. This rather dramatic example shows how communication between modules, in this case hemispheres, is what normally produces our unified experience. When the communication is cut, each side continues processing in its own way. The fact that we don't normally feel like two people in one head is because our brain's halves are in constant conversation, binding their experiences together. Sever that connection and the plurality becomes evident. Nausea. This is a condition where a patient is paralyzed or cognitively impaired due to a brain lesion, but vehemently denies there's anything wrong. For instance, someone with left side paralysis due to a right hemisphere stroke might insist they can move just fine and confabulate excuses when confronted with evidence they cannot. This often results from right parietal lobe damage. What does this have to do with distributed intelligence? It appears that the brain's body schema module, the network that creates our sense of owning and controlling our limbs, can be damaged, as can self-monitoring circuits that detect errors or contradictions. Other parts of the brain, perhaps the language-dominant left hemisphere, then weave a narrative that everything is okay because the usual signals that, hey, we have a deficit, aren't coming through. The person's conscious belief is that they can move, because the modules that would normally inform them of paralysis are offline. It's a failure of integration between the motor system and the self-awarenessness system. Different subsystems have diverging views of reality, and without proper communication, the person's mind sticks with the story provided by the intact modules. often the left hemisphere interpreter, which tries to make sense of things even if it has to invent explanations. These examples, and others like them, underscore a profound point. Our sense of being a single unified self is actively constructed by the brain, not given. And it doesn't take much to make that unity unravel. A cut fiber tract here, a lesion there, and the multitude of agents in our head become apparent. Or, as one patient said after a stroke, I feel like there's someone else in my head. And we're not always in agreement. It's unsettling but also illuminating. It tells us that under the hood, we are already a multitude. The implications of this extend beyond neurology, into everyday social cognition and even future AI design. In social neuroscience, for example, there's evidence that our ability to understand others, to mind read, in a non-mystical sense, is mediated by specialized systems. Mirror neurons help simulate others' actions. The medial prefrontal and temporoparietal areas help infer others' thoughts and intentions. Emotional empathy is processed in yet other circuits. These operate semi-independently. One can be impaired while others are intact. Certain brain injuries or developmental conditions might knock out one component, say the ability to intuit others' beliefs, but leave another, like feeling distress at others' pain, intact, leading to very uneven social cognition profiles. It's as if the social brain itself is a distributed committee of processes, one handling imitation, one handling empathy, one handling theory of mind. Its damage to or disconnection of one module, for instance, a lesion in the right temporoparietal junction, might reduce the ability to understand others' perspectives, can make a person seem uncaring or socially odd in one respect, while they may remain perfectly adept in other interpersonal skills. Again, not one center, but many working parts. In artificial intelligence, these insights are inspiring architects to design AI that isn't just one huge neural network trying to do everything. We could imagine, and some have begun developing, AI systems composed of multiple agents or networks, each with a specialty. For example, one sub-segment devoted to ethical reasoning, another to logical planning, another to modeling human intentions, that together tackle complex problems. Such an AI might negotiate internally, much like our brain does, with a mediator agent that integrates the suggestions of each subsystem. This could be important for AI in high-stakes domains. Rather than trusting one monolithic opaque network to drive a car or manage a power grid, a multi-segment system could have redundancy and internal cross-checks. One agent says, the road is clear. Another says, but my sensor data suggests something. And a third resolves the discrepancy. In essence, we might recapitulate in silicon what evolution did in brains, achieve robust intelligence by not putting all our eggs in one cognitive basket. We've journeyed from the micro/mold cells to the macro, social groups and AI networks, and a common theme emerges. Intelligence is not housed in one place. It arises from interactions. Many small minds can, under the right conditions, create one big mind. Those conditions involve communication, feedback, adaptation, and sometimes competition. When those conditions fail, the apparent mind fractures back into many pieces. Collective minds, intelligence beyond the individual. So far, we've mostly discussed distributed intelligence within an organism, but the idea scales upward. Can the same principles apply across multiple organisms? In other words, can a group of individuals, each with their own brains or simpler circuits, form a kind of superbrain that thinks and learns as a collective? There is compelling evidence that the answer is yes. We already saw hints in social insects and mole rat. Let's broaden the scope to human societies, multi-species teams, and even ecosystems. Think of a classroom engaged in a discussion. A teacher poses a question. Students offer various answers. Ideas are built upon or refuted. Misunderstandings are corrected. Eventually, the class as a whole arrives at a deeper understanding of the topic. No single individual's brain contains the whole knowledge. It's the interplay that generates the learning. This is an example of distributed cognition in a social network. The communication between people, via language, gestures, shared context, acts like the synapses between neurons. Each student is like a neuron contributing their piece. The group's knowledge can exceed that of any one member. Just as a neural network can store patterns none of its individual neurons comprehend alone. Human culture, in fact, is a vast repository of distributed intelligence. Technologies like writing, the internet libraries, these are often called cognitive extensions because they allow us to offload memory and computation into the environment. When you do long multiplication on paper or use a calculator, you're effectively thinking in tandem with an external tool. If you don't know an answer but you know how to Google it, in a sense the internet plus your brain knows the answer. Philosophers like Edwin Hutchins and Andy Clark have argued exactly this, that human cognition has always been a loop between brain, body, and world, with tools and symbols and other people forming an extended mind beyond the skin. A lone human on a desert island is a very different kind of mind than a human immersed in language and society. Our thoughts are not entirely our own. They are shaped and even carried by the networks of people and artifacts around us. Beyond humans, many animals engage in collective behaviors that border on collective thought. Dolphins, for instance, hunt in coordinated groups. In some populations, they herd fish into bait bowls by circling them, each dolphin knowing exactly when to swoop through the concentrated school for a bite, taking turns so that the school remains tight. They communicate with clicks and whistles throughout, and if one strategy isn't working, they'll improvisationally switch roles or tactics. None of this is centrally commanded. It's a team sport, with real-time adjustment, a group computation to maximize everyone's success. Chimpanzees form political coalitions. Two lower-ranked males might team up to overthrow a dominant male, remembering past alliances and leveraging social bonds. Doing so requires each chimp to predict how others will react. If I support you, will you support me later? What if the alpha retaliates? Such social maneuvering has been called Machiavellian intelligence, and it likely drove primate brain evolution in part. It's distributed in that no single chimp owns the coalition. It emerges from each individual pursuing their social goals with mutual modeling of each other's minds. Remarkably, distributed cognition can even occur across species. Think of a person riding a horse. The human and the horse form a coupled system, each reading the other's cues, achieving together what neither could alone: speedy travel with navigation. A more symbiotic example is the relationship between humans and dogs. Over tens of thousands of years of domestication, dogs have evolved an uncanny ability to attune to human gestures, tones, and even facial expressions. A dog can follow a human pointing gesture as well as a toddler can, and can interpret our moods from voice and posture. In turn, humans have learned to interpret barks, whines, and tail wags. When a person and their dog solve a task together, say searching for a lost hiker in the case of a rescue dog and handler, they form a distributed system that shares information and coordinates action, effectively functioning as one cooperative unit with interwoven cognition. Neither fully controls the other, but each influences and complements the other's decisions. We have essentially plugged a non-human animal into our social cognitive network. The same goes for working animals like shepherd dogs, or even more ancient partnerships like those between early humans and wolf dogs that might have helped our survival. In nature, mutualisms show coordinated behavior that enhances both parties' intelligence in a broad sense. Cleaner fish, which eat parasites off bigger client fish, engage in a delicate dance of trust and timing. The clients allow the cleaners to come in and clean them, even entering their mouths at times. A risky proposition if the big fish decided to chomp down. The cleaner has to signal its intentions with a kind of fish body language, and the client often adopts a specific posture to indicate it's ready to be cleaned. If the cleaner fish cheats, takes a bite of healthy flesh, clients remember and might chase or avoid that cleaner in the future. This implies some form of memory and expectation on both sides. A joint behavior that arises from the interaction of two different species' simple rules. Cleaners rule, eat parasites, but don't anger the big fish too much. Clients rule, trust the small fish unless it proves untrustworthy. Over time, their coordinated dance solves a problem, parasite removal, that neither could solve alone. Perhaps one of the most marvelous distributed intelligences is that of ecosystems. Trees in a forest are connected by vast underground networks of mycorrhizal fungi, the wood wide web. Through these connections they can exchange nutrients and even signals. A tacked tree can send chemical warnings through the network, prompting distant trees to ramp up defenses. Resources can be shuttled. A big, healthy tree may transport sugars to younger saplings via the fungal network, almost like a rudimentary economic system. Some ecologists, like Suzanne Simard, have suggested that these forest networks exhibit a form of ecosystem learning or memory. For example, a forest that experiences a severe drought seems to respond faster to the next drought, possibly because the network remembers the stress in changed fungal or root structures or soil chemistry. This is still an area of active research and some debate, but it challenges our neurocentric notion of intelligence, and by the opera chondra, We are witnessing this new knowledge of intelligence. If a network of trees and fungi can adapt to past events and improve its collective resilience, functioning almost like a giant organism, should we not consider that a kind of distributed intelligence as well? It might not be conscious, a forest likely doesn't feel or think in the way we do, but by our earlier definition of thinking, information processing, learning, optimizing responses, it may qualify on some level. The key point here is that cognition may not be bounded by the individual. It can propagate into the environment and across individuals. Our brains, interfacing with books, computers, and each other, form something beyond what any of us is alone. This idea has been dramatized by the concept of a global brain, the notion that the internet and humanity together form a massive distributed intelligence that is learning and evolving. This is not science fiction. We see hints of it whenever collective platforms solve problems. Consider Wikipedia. No single person knows all its content, yet it's an encyclopedia that updates in real time as a result of many local contributions and error corrections. Markets, too, have been described as information processors that no single trader or regulator fully controls. They aggregate vast amounts of data, prices, supply, demand, via local interactions of buyers and sellers. Sometimes they display intelligence-efficient allocation of resources, other times severe irrationality, bubbles and crashes. And the reasons are analogous to what we discussed. If interactions follow certain rules, the collective can be smart. If not, it can go haywire. Why do crowds sometimes find wise solutions and other times spiral into madness? Research on the wisdom of crowds shows that when individuals make decisions or estimates independently and then aggregate, for instance, averaging many people's guesses of an ox's weight, the result can be very accurate, often more accurate than any expert. Diversity of opinion and independent contribution are key. But if individuals excessively influence each other or share the same biases, the crowd can become a herd that rushes off a cliff or panics unnecessarily. The difference between a smart crowd and a dumb mob lies in the patterns of communication. When people communicate openly, bring different knowledge to the table, and update their beliefs based on shared evidence, the group can solve puzzles and self-organize effectively. For example, volunteer networks that organize disaster relief often manage to coordinate supplies and aid faster than centralized efforts. However, when communication breaks down or is purely emotional, like during a riot where fear and anger propagate without check, the collective loses coherence and control. Essentially, a crowd can function like a distributed brain, and similar rules apply. If signals are too noisy or feedback's too positive, everyone amplifying each other's fear, the system becomes unstable. Interestingly, the same tensions exist within our brains. A healthy brain is richly connected, dynamic, and adaptive, much like a well-informed collaborative community. A troubled brain, say in a manic episode or under psychedelic drugs, might experience runaway positive feedback. Every thought triggers another so fast that there's racing ideas or hallucinations, akin to a crowd stampede of thoughts. In depression or certain neurodegenerative diseases, connectivity can become impoverished, akin to individuals in a community not communicating, leading to fragmented, uncoordinated mental activity, perhaps experienced as cognitive fog or lack of focus. In schizophrenia, as mentioned, it may be inappropriate interactions among networks, like a crowd full of conflicting rumors, that yield an incoherent narrative, delusions. Thus, the brain crowd can also be wise or foolish, stable or chaotic, depending on how its components interact. Mental health, in a sense, is the coherence of a distributed system, and mental illness often the loss of that coherence. From octopus arms to forest webs, from neurons in a cortex to people in a classroom, the story repeats. When semi-autonomous modules communicate efficiently, respect feedback, and coordinate their actions in real time, intelligence emerges. This scaling principle, that the whole can be smart when the parts are networked properly, is likely to be central in the future of both neuroscience and AI. We are learning to map the human brain's connectome, essentially trying to read the wiring diagram of our 86 billion neurons. But it's not just the wiring, it's the dynamics on that wiring that matter. Similarly, building AI might shift from making one super powerful algorithm to orchestrating an ensemble of specialized intelligences working in concert. Some experts envision an AI that's less like a single genius and more like a society of mind, with different modules for vision, language, planning, ethics, etc., communicating to create emergent solutions, very much parallel to what we've been discussing about brains and colonies. Evolution's experiments in distributed intelligence. How did these different systems, slime molds, insects, octopuses, mammals, etc., end up with such varied approaches to intelligence? The short answer is ecology and evolution. Different environments and challenges reward different cognitive architectures. Evolution is a great tinkerer that doesn't design from scratch. It modifies existing parts, sometimes adding new centralized components, other times relying on distributed ones, depending on what works best for survival and reproduction. Let's consider two extremes, the octopus and the elephant. Octopuses evolved in the ocean, an environment where they are both predators and prey. They have short lifespans, often just 1-2 years, and largely solitary lives. There is huge selective pressure on them to be agile, to explore complex seascapes for food, and to avoid myriad predators by camouflage or hiding. Having a distributed nervous system, arms that can independently probe and react, is fantastically useful in this context. It allows simultaneous problem-solving in multiple directions in a visually complex 3D environment with lots of hiding spots and obstacles. The octopus's design maximizes simultaneity. It can check small crevices for crab, while keeping an eye, literally, out for sharks. If every arm had to ask the brain, "Hey, should I grab this?" the delays would be costly. Instead, arms handle local decisions. The brain focuses on the big picture, like coordinating a quick escape by jet propulsion if a predator is spotted. The result is a creature supremely adapted for a life with no guarantees and no safe home base, a perpetual improviser. It's telling that octopuses evolved no protective outer shell, unlike their cousins squids and cuttlefish, which have internal shells, or snails, which have external ones. They made a trade-off. No shell means vulnerability, but it also means flexibility and speed. To survive with that trade-off, they doubled down on intelligent behavior, camouflaging, strategizing, and fast adapting, which their distributed neural network facilitates. The octopus basically embodies the idea. Think with your whole body. And it works for their niche. Now, elephants, on the other hand, are long-lived, highly social mammals with few natural predators once they're adults. Their challenges are different. They need to manage long-term social relationships in a herd, find scarce resources like water over large territories, sometimes with years between rains, and care for offspring over decades. Elephants have the largest brains of any land animal, around 5 kg, with an enormous number of neurons, especially in the cerebrum. They show signs of self-awareness. They recognize themselves in mirrors, grief, and even a kind of reverence for their dead. These are hallmarks of a more centralized, reflective intelligence, tuned for long-term planning and social complexity. Their world is not as frenetic as the octopus's reef. It's more about slowly evolving challenges, droughts, migratory routes, complex social hierarchies over decades. A big centralized brain that can store vast memories, e.g. where the watering holes were 10 years ago, or recognizing hundreds of other elephants and their past interactions, is extremely useful. The social brain hypothesis posits that large brains in primates and some other mammals evolved to handle the demands of social living, remembering allies and rivals, coordinating within a group, maybe even empathizing or deceiving. In elephants, we see a prime example, large brains enabling a form of centralized cognition that can simulate scenarios, perhaps feel something akin to empathy, and make decisions that weigh many factors, like a matriarch leading her herd to water based on her memory and her assessment of the herd's needs. Does this mean elephant-like animals have no distributed aspects? Not exactly. They too have local circuits for posture, reflexes, etc. But comparatively, their intelligence seems more centralized than the octopus model. Evolution didn't have a single path to making animals smarter. It chose architectures that fit the lifestyle. Cephalopods, octopus, squid, went for the multiple brains route. Many social mammals went for the big integrated brain route. Birds are interesting. Corvids, crows, ravens, and parrots are extremely smart. Yet their brain organization is quite different from mammals. They don't have a layered cortex. Instead, they have nuclei, clusters of neurons, in their forebrain that are densely interconnected. For a long time, scientists underestimated bird intelligence because their brain looked so different. But we now know some birds can use tools, solve puzzles with insight, remember dozens of cache locations for food, and even demonstrate rudimentary theory of mind, inferring that another bird might steal their cache. A parrot's brain with 1 billion neurons can rival a monkey's with much more volume, partly because bird neurons are smaller and more tightly packed, and their brain wiring has a short-distance loop architecture that allows fast interactions between modules. In essence, evolution found a way to create high cognitive power in birds by a different kind of distributed network, one that is not layered like ours, but still achieves rich connectivity and parallel processing. Corvids and parrots, with brains the size of a walnut, can outperform some apes on certain tasks. This teaches us that what matters is not just brain size or presence of a cortex, but the network topology and neuron count. Birds have a very high neuron count for their brain size, especially in critical areas of the pallium, and a wiring that effectively makes their brain a distributed information hub. They evolved intelligence in a way quite separate from primates, showing convergent evolution toward cognition, using a different blueprint. Yet the end result, flexible, innovative behavior, is similar. Nature is wonderfully inventive in its implementations of distributed intelligence. Even within the primate lineage, evolution didn't strictly increase centralization at the expense of modularity, it did both. In our ancestors, we see an expansion of integrative areas like the prefrontal cortex, giving more top-down control and planning ability, and a proliferation of specialized circuits, like those for facial recognition, language, etc. For instance, primates evolved dedicated patches in the visual cortex just for recognizing faces, a very specific module that even has neurons responding only to particular face orientations. We also evolved mirror neuron systems that help us learn by observing and empathize with others' actions. Our brains became a mix of general-purpose processors and special-purpose add-ons, integrated by connective hubs. As one neuroscientist quipped, evolution didn't write a whole new operating system for the brain. It kept adding apps and wiring them together. It's messy, but it works. We have emotional circuits, probably inherited from early mammals, layered with cognitive circuits that came later. And the two often tussle. When you're on a diet and see cake, that's an ancient reward system saying, "Eat sugar now," and a newer control system saying, "Remember your long-term goal." Whichever wins reflects that internal politics we spoke of. We should note that distributed versus centralized is not a binary, it's a spectrum, and most organisms fall somewhere in between. Humans, for example, have a highly centralized command center, the brain, compared to a jellyfish. But within that brain, we have extensive decentralization. Our cerebral cortex itself has many semi-redundant units, like hundreds of cortical columns that each can do a bit of processing, or the left and right hemispheres that can to some extent take over functions if one side is damaged. And we've externalized some of our intelligence into culture and devices, effectively distributing cognition outside our bodies. Evolution seems to favor hierarchical designs in complex, unpredictable environments. A. Hierarchy is a network where any given part can be leader or follower, depending on context. Much like a jazz ensemble, as opposed to a symphony with a strict conductor. Our world, full of sudden changes, diverse tasks, and social interactions, is exactly the kind of environment where a pure rigid hierarchy would fail. Too slow, too inflexible, and a pure swarm would also fail, might lack direction or unity at critical moments. So we have a bit of both. Hierarchical layers, spinal cord ventral cortex connections, feedback loops, every which way, etc. In fact, the human brain is often described as a small world network, meaning it has clusters of densely interconnected neurons, modules, with some long-range hub connections linking these clusters. This type of network strikes a balance between local specialization and global integration, and it's found not only in brains but in many evolved and even human-engineered systems. For example, social networks, airline routes. It's efficient. You get short path lengths, quick communication, without requiring everything to talk to everything, which would be resource expensive and noisy. Our brain's default, salience, and executive networks we mentioned are an example. Each is like a cluster that processes information internally, but they connect via hub regions, like the anterior cingulate cortex might connect the salience and executive networks. Damage a hub, and you effectively isolate a cluster, hence the issues in stroke we noted. Damage a peripheral part, and the network can often reroute or compensate. One more evolutionary perspective. Early life on Earth was dominated by decentralized organisms. Bacteria, for instance, show remarkable collective behavior through quorum sensing. They can detect when their population reaches a certain density by releasing signaling molecules, and then they collectively change behavior, like emitting light, as in bioluminescent bacteria in a squid's light organ, or launching an infection once they sense they have enough numbers. Biofilms, slimy aggregates of microbes, can have channels for nutrients and waste, almost like a primitive circulatory system, all self-organized by chemical gradients. Slime molds we discussed are another example at the unicellular level. Only later did more centralized organisms like those with nervous systems evolve. And even then, the first nervous systems, think of a jellyfish or sea anemone, were nerve nets, diffuse meshes of neurons without a clear brain. These nets can mediate coordinated behavior. A jellyfish contracts its bell in a wave to swim, using a distributed pacemaker system. Some jellyfish even have structures called ropalia that contain neurons and sensory organs. A recent study showed Caribbean box jellyfish can learn from experience. They can be trained via associative learning, like Pavlov's dogs, but with a light pattern and a shock, to avoid obstacles. This is learning happening in a creature with no brain, only a distributed neural net and a few neuron clusters. It suggests that the ability to learn and adapt emerged very early and does not strictly require a central brain. It might be an intrinsic property of any sufficiently interconnected network of excitable cells. Brains, when they came along, were like the crown jewel, on top of a long scaffolding of distributed processes. They didn't replace those processes. They co-opted and coordinated them. That's why even we with our big brains still have reflexes and gut feelings and social contagion effects. Those older distributed mechanisms are still in there, operating as they always have, just usually kept in check or harnessed by higher centers.
Conclusion: brains without bosses.
In winding our way through slime molds, bees, octopuses, and human brains, we arrive at a humbling realization. Intelligence is a dance, not a dictator. The human tendency is to look for a boss, a president in the White House of the brain, a queen in the ant colony, a lead alpha in the elephant herd. But again and again, nature shows us systems that achieve sophisticated outcomes without one central commander. Life had organized problem-solving systems long before neurons came onto the scene. Bacteria were coordinating in colonies, fungi were networking through soils, immune cells were teaming up to fight viruses, all without a control tower neuron barking orders. The arrival of brains was not the invention of coordinated intelligence, but rather an added layer, a highly useful one, on a much older foundation of distributed organization.
Our own brain, far from being an exception to this pattern, is perhaps the most exquisite example. We do not find a control center in the brain where consciousness or decision-making singularly resides. Instead, we find circuits and subcircuits, loops and feedbacks. The prefrontal cortex might be thought of as the CEO of sorts, but even it does not act alone. It's more of a chairman mediating among powerful board members, emotional circuits, memory circuits, sensory cortices, and trying to forge a consensus that results in a decision.
Our sense of self, the feeling that I am one indivisible person, is in a sense a beautifully rendered illusion, a user-friendly interface over the messy reality of many subselves. That interface can break. In neurological or psychiatric conditions, or under the influence of psychedelics, people can feel a loss of unity, a sense that their usual singular identity has fragmented, or that thoughts emerge from elsewhere. These experiences reinforce what the science tells us. The brain is a city, not a kingdom. It has bustling districts of specialization, traffic hubs of communication, quiet back alleys of isolated processing, and, remarkably, it usually manages to operate as a harmonious whole.
To return to our opening metaphor, is your brain a boss or a committee? All evidence points to the latter, and perhaps counterintuitively, that is its genius. A committee, or better, a community, of diverse members can solve more varied problems and adapt to change better than any single authority, provided the community has good governance. Your brain's governance includes things like attention, which at any moment acts like a spotlight, guided by salience networks, essentially electing a coalition of neurons to power, and neuromodulators like dopamine and serotonin that broadly tune the system's activity modes.
It's a dynamic governance, one that shifts leadership as needed. When you're threatened, a circuit in the brainstem, the periaqueductal gray, might transiently assume command to initiate a freeze or fight response. When you're learning something, the hippocampus, an episodic memory module, might lead the consolidation process. When you're planning, the frontal lobes take charge. This fluidity is key. Fixed hierarchies calcify and fail in unpredictable environments, whereas flexible networks can reconfigure. Our brains, at their best, reconfigure in milliseconds.
Let's also circle back to the very large scale as we conclude. If minds are distributed, then where does one mind end and another begin? If you think about it, the boundaries are blurry. Is a pair of lovers finishing each other's sentences functioning partly as one cognitive unit? When you use Google Maps to navigate, is the app part of your mind? Some cognitive scientists would say yes. The phone plus user is the true thinking system in that moment. We constantly incorporate external elements into our thinking. Notebooks, smartphones, other people's brains via conversation. This suggests a vision of humanity as not 8 billion separate minds, but as 8 billion nodes in a connected cognitive network, with technology as additional nodes. The late physicist Heinz von Forster once said, "If you desire to see, learn how to act." We could add, if we desire to understand intelligence, learn how to see it as interaction rather than as an object. The boundaries of an intelligent system are defined by the interactions, the information flow, not by the physical skin or shell. A forest, a market, a hive, a brain, a culture. Why not analyze them all with the same fundamental principles of networks, feedback, and adaptation? Doing so might lead us to new insights. For instance, perhaps consciousness, that special feeling of subjective awareness, arises not from a specific spot in the brain, but from a network configuration that integrates many processes into a coherent whole. Some theories, like the global neuronal workspace or integrated information theory, indeed propose that consciousness is what it feels like to have information unified across distant brain regions.
Rather than hunting for a center of consciousness, a fool's errand akin to finding the one transistor in a computer that is the center of the program, we might better ask, what network state underlies conscious awareness? Similarly, instead of asking where is memory stored, we increasingly see it as stored everywhere, in patterns of connections. Hence why memory loss in dementia is not like losing files from a cabinet one by one, but more like a network defragmenting. The distributed view forces us to shift questions, and possibly leads to more fruitful answers.
Circling back to where we began, lateralization via distributed intelligence. The brain's left-right specialization is one form of dividing up cognitive labor. But what we've seen is that nature had many ways to divide or not divide labor. An octopus distributes across its body, a bee colony distributes across individuals, a human brain distributes across networks and hemispheres, a society distributes across people and their tools. Life thrives without a single boss in many contexts. When there is a boss, like a dominant alpha animal, it often emerges from the network dynamics and can be overthrown or adapted to. It's not a fixed top-down blueprint like a designed machine.
In fact, whenever humans design very large complex systems, say the internet or Wikipedia, we inadvertently end up recreating distributed, self-organizing structures because no one can centrally manage the whole. The internet routes packets like an ant colony, foraging based on local rules, protocols, and without a central router for the entire network. Wikipedia grows and polices itself through local edits and feedback, rather than an editor-in-chief vetting every article. It seems that to scale complexity, you must relinquish centralized control to some degree.
Perhaps then it's fitting to conclude with an ancient wisdom. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. In neuroscience, we amend that to the whole emerges from the interactions of its parts. Your brain is not a throne room with a king neuron on the throne. It's a vibrant city or ecosystem of cells and signals. Its brilliance lies not in strict order, but in orchestrated chaos. Its power lies not in uniform control, but in rich connections. And you, as the inhabitant of this distributed mind, are in a very real sense a society of mind, a multitude that most days speaks in unison as a single voice only by the grace of successful self-integration. So as you leave this lecture, take a moment to reflect on the committee meeting inside your head. When you hear yourself think, what you're actually hearing is the murmurs, debates, and agreements of countless neural subsystems convening. Amazingly, that cacophony feels like one mind, you. But now you appreciate the illusion. That unity is hard won, constantly renegotiated, and sometimes broken, and that's okay. In fact, that's how it's supposed to be. We are living proof that a brain without a single boss can not only work, but produce art, science, love, and all the wonders of human life.
Nature, from the smallest slime mold to the sprawling human internet, operates on the principle that intelligence emerges, it's not bestowed. By a dictator, it's grown by a democracy, albeit a strange one. In understanding this, we not only advance science and engineering, but also perhaps gain a bit of humility. We, with our mighty brains, are not apart from the rest of life's web of collective intelligence. We are an outgrowth of it. An example of distributed intelligence in action, at one particular scale and flavor.
Long before brains evolved, life learned to coordinate and solve problems in a distributed fashion. Brains are just the latest chapter in that story, and as we contemplate building AI or organizing human societies, we would do well to remember the lessons of these earlier chapters. The future might belong not to a single superintelligent AI or a single genius leader, but to networks of intelligences, human, machine, or hybrid, working without a singular boss, yet achieving great things together, just like the neurons in your brain are doing right now as you comprehend these words. Thank you for listening. In this lecture, we traversed a world of brains without bosses. I hope it's left you with a deeper appreciation for the chorus of voices, neural, animal, and human, that collectively create what we call mind. Let the idea percolate and resonate among the many parts of your own mind and see what new thoughts emerge. After all, you're not thinking alone. You've got a whole swarm inside you, and that is nature's true genius.